night has a way of softening sharp edges. Thoughts slow down. Certainty loosens its grip. What seemed solid during the day begins to blur, not into confusion, but into something gentler and more honest. History, when approached at this hour, stops behaving like a sequence of bold decisions and heroic clarity. It begins to resemble a long series of tired people doing the best they could with aching bodies, strained nerves, and minds that had not rested properly in years. This is not the version of history carved into stone monuments or compressed into textbooks. This is history as it actually unfolded, quietly, unevenly, often while everyone involved was exhausted. Before you drift any deeper, if this quiet helps you feel safe tonight, you are welcome to stay with us. Subscribing softly keeps this place gentle and lets these nights continue. There is nothing demanding your attention here. No urgency, no alarms, just space to rest. History is written by humans. That statement sounds obvious until you sit with it long enough for its weight to settle. Humans do not operate like machines. They grow tired. They carry pain in their joints. They miss sleep. They wake up already anxious about the day ahead. Ancient rulers were no exception. In fact, they often lived under pressures that would make modern stress seem like background noise. Endless political maneuvering, constant threats of betrayal, the knowledge that one poor decision could collapse an entire dynasty. This was the daily environment in which many of history's most influential choices were made. What makes this unsettling is not that people struggled. It is how normalized that struggle became. Exhaustion was not seen as a problem to solve. It was simply part of the job. If the body resisted, medicine did not aim to restore balance or health in the way we imagine today. Ancient medicine focused on quieting symptoms, calming the mind, dulling pain, slowing thought just enough to make the weight bearable. Relief mattered more than clarity. In the stillness of night, this begins to feel familiar. Many of us understand what it means to keep going on reduced sleep, to operate on half a mind because stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. Ancient rulers did the same. They ruled through haze, through lingering aches, through nights broken into fragments rather than true rest. Decisions were often made not from sharp strategy, but from the simple desire to make the discomfort stop. There is a subtle irony in this. We often imagine history being shaped by moments of intense focus and brilliance. In reality, much of it was guided by people trying to get through another day without unraveling. Medicine offered tools for that purpose, herbs that softened anxiety, drinks that dulled physical pain, preparations that quieted racing thoughts. The goal was not enlightenment, it was tolerability. At night, this reframes power in a quieter way. Power was not always exercised by confident minds. It was often managed by people leaning on whatever allowed them to function. Sometimes that meant thinking less rather than more, slower rather than sharper. This does not diminish their impact. It makes it more human. There is also a gentle, dark humor hiding here. Empires built on grand ideals were often administered by individuals who had not slept properly in years. Laws that shaped generations may have been drafted while their authors were aching, sedated, or simply worn down. We tend to assume clarity leads to greatness. History suggests endurance played a much larger role. Late-night history prefers this version, not because it is dramatic, but because it is honest. When the world quiets down, it becomes easier to admit that humans have always navigated complexity while tired. That progress rarely comes from perfect conditions. It emerges from persistence under imperfect ones. Ancient medicine understood this in its own rough way. It did not promise cures, it promised relief, a quieter mind, a softer body, enough calm to keep moving forward. In modern terms, this might sound inadequate. In historical context, it was often the only option available, and people took it without hesitation, not out of weakness, but out of necessity. As you listen now, perhaps with your own thoughts slowing and edges softening, you are closer to those historical moments than you might expect. The state between full alertness and sleep is not a failure of focus. It is a natural condition, one that humans have inhabited for as long as they have carried responsibility. History unfolds well in this space, not loudly, not with grand declarations, but as a series of quiet adjustments made by people who were tired and continued anyway. The unsettling part is not that they were imperfect. It is that we often forget how much of the past was shaped under conditions very similar to our own late nights. The night allows this realization without judgment. It does not demand conclusions. It simply holds the idea gently and lets it rest. The idea that history was not driven solely by ambition or brilliance, but by endurance, by bodies that needed relief, by minds that learned to function while dulled and slowed. There is something comforting in that. If the past was built under such conditions and still moved forward, then perhaps our own tired moments are not signs of failure. They are simply part of the long human pattern. Now let the quiet settle. There is nothing you need to solve. History will remain here whether you analyze it or not. For now it is enough to let the night do what it does best. Soften the noise, ease the tension, and remind you that even the largest stories were carried by people who needed rest. Stay as long as you like, or drift away gently. Either way, the night continues. At night, the past does not arrive loudly. It does not announce itself with banners or battles. It slips in slowly like a thought you did not invite but somehow recognize. History sounds different when the day has gone quiet. Power becomes smaller. Decisions feel heavier. People who once seemed monumental begin to resemble tired figures sitting alone in lamplit rooms, listening to their own breathing. This is a good hour to speak about rulers, not as symbols but as bodies, not as legends, but as people trying to survive the weight of authority with whatever tools were close at hand. There was a time when ruling meant never being alone with silence. Councils waited. Messengers arrived at dawn. Threats did not sleep. For a queen, the day did not end when the sun disappeared. It simply changed shape. Night was not rest. It was the space where exhaustion finally caught up. Muscles ached. Thoughts slowed. Worries replayed themselves without mercy. In those hours, the crown felt less like a symbol and more like a physical object pressing down on the skull. The private chamber was meant to offer relief, not comfort in the modern sense, but containment. Thick walls, heavy curtains, a single table, and somewhere nearby a cabinet, small, unremarkable, quietly powerful. This was not a place of luxury. It was a place of function. Inside were jars and bundles and powders prepared by physicians who believed the mind needed managing as much as the realm did. Opium rested there without drama, not as a vice, but as a solution. Sleep mattered. Pain interfered with governance. If the body refused to cooperate, it had to be persuaded. A cup prepared at night could soften the sharp edges of the day. It could quiet thoughts that refused to stand down. No one asked whether this was wise. The question was simpler. Would it work? Mandrake followed its own reputation. Roots twisted into shapes that made people uncomfortable. Stories clung to it. None of that mattered when the queen needed calm. It was believed to steady nerves and dull fear, a plant that promised quiet in a world that offered none. Dosage was not a careful science. It was an inherited habit. A little more if the night felt too long, a little less if the morning demanded clarity. Henbane joined the collection as well, less gentle, more decisive. It carried the promise of silence, of the mind stepping back for a while. Physicians spoke of balance, of settling disturbances. In practice, it meant stillness, and stillness was valuable. A ruler who could sit quietly, without trembling or pacing, was considered stable. The means were less important than the result. There is something darkly humorous in this arrangement. Empires measured in land and armies were often managed by people whose evenings revolved around plant-based sedation. Decisions that shaped borders may have followed nights of chemically encouraged rest. History textbooks do not include the cabinet. They focus on proclamations. They skip the part where power needed help sleeping. Medical thinking at the time did not question strength. It assumed fragility. The body was understood as something that needed constant adjustment. If thoughts ran too fast, they were slowed. If emotions rose too high, they were pressed down. A queen showing strain was not a sign of weakness. It was expected. The solution was intervention rather than reflection. Late at night, this logic feels familiar. Many of us have known the desire to quiet the mind rather than explore it, to stop feeling rather than understand. The difference is scale. A queen carried not just personal anxiety, but the consequences of an entire state. Rest was not indulgence, it was maintenance. The cabinet also served another purpose: privacy. In a court where everything was observed, this was one of the few spaces where the ruler could act without performance. No advisors, no petitioners, just the slow ritual of preparation. The cup, the scent, the pause before drinking. It was a moment where control returned briefly to the body rather than the crown. Physicians did not speak softly out of concern. They spoke confidently out of tradition. Generations before them had used the same remedies. The fact that these substances altered perception was not alarming. It was the point. A calmer mind ruled better, or at least more predictably. Stability mattered more than sharpness. This raises an unsettling thought. How many decisions were made not from clarity, but from relief? How often did the desire for quiet outweigh long-term vision? A tired ruler might choose the option that promised fewer immediate disturbances rather than lasting peace. Not out of malice, but out of fatigue. And yet the system persisted because it worked well enough. Kingdoms continued, successions occurred, wars were planned and treaties signed, all while the cabinet remained in use, a silent assistant in the background of power. There is no moral lesson hiding here, just a pattern. Authority strains the body responds with demands. Medicine meets those demands with whatever knowledge it has. In this case, plants carried the burden. They did not offer wisdom, they offered rest. And rest was rare. At night, the story feels less dramatic and more intimate. A woman alone in a chamber, the weight of responsibility settling into her bones. The cabinet opened without ceremony. The choice made not for pleasure, but for survival. The world outside would wake soon enough. For now, there was only the need to make the mind manageable. History does not record these moments carefully. It prefers outcomes. But late-night history lingers on process, on the quiet compromises that allowed power to continue functioning. The cabinet was one of those compromises. Not a scandal, not a secret, just a tool. As the night deepens, it becomes easier to see how human all of this was. The crown did not remove pain, it amplified it, and so the solution was not strength, but softening, not clarity, but calm. Somewhere behind the walls of history, the cabinet closed, the candle dimmed, the queen rested in a state that was neither fully alert nor fully asleep. Enough awareness to rule, enough quiet to endure, and history moved forward, as it always has, slowly, unevenly, guided by people who needed help getting through the night. The cabinet did not disappear when the queen left the room. It stayed where it was, quiet, patient, waiting. Power changes hands, but habits tend to remain. The tools that softened one ruler were rarely discarded for the next. When the crown passed to a king, the cabinet simply adjusted its contents. Different jars, stronger scents, bolder promises. The night did not ask whether the ruler was wise or reckless. It only asked how much strain the body could carry before something gave way. Kings were expected to endure more openly. Strength was performed rather than discussed. Pain was hidden behind posture, doubt behind ceremony. But the body noticed everything: the long councils, the endless disputes, the subtle pressure of knowing that hesitation could be mistaken for weakness. By the time night arrived, the performance became difficult to maintain. That was when the mixture entered the story. Alchemy was not magic in the way later centuries would imagine it. It was experimentation with confidence, a belief that nature held solutions if one was bold enough to combine them. Powders from distant regions, resins scraped from unfamiliar trees, roots dried until their original shape was barely recognizable. The mixtures promised clarity, or courage, or calm, sometimes all three at once. No one expected precision, they expected effect. A king did not drink cautiously. Caution suggested doubt. Doubt suggested vulnerability. The mixture was taken with confidence because confidence itself was part of its purpose. If the king believed it would sharpen his mind, then at least for a while it often did. If he believed it would make him fearless, then fear seemed to retreat. Not because the world had changed, but because perception had shifted just enough to make hesitation fade. This is where the irony settles in quietly. Political decisions made under the influence of experimental blends were not considered irresponsible. They were considered informed. The king was engaging with knowledge. With science as it existed at the time, the court approved. The physicians nodded. The advisors learned to watch. They learned the signs. A calm entrance meant the mixture had been gentle. A restless pacing suggested something stronger. A smile held too long usually indicated confidence beyond necessity. When the king spoke slowly and with unusual warmth, the court relaxed. When his words arrived too quickly, overlapping one another, they prepared for unpredictability. No one commented openly. That would have been unwise. Instead, the court adapted. Meetings were shortened or extended based on tone. Difficult topics were delayed when the king appeared euphoric. Straightforward matters were presented when his focus narrowed sharply. This was not manipulation. It was survival. The kingdom learned to read the state of its ruler the way sailors read weather. Alchemy promised understanding. In practice, it delivered sensation. The mixtures affected mood first. Judgment followed. A king who felt invincible might push for bold action. A king who felt suspicious might see threats where none existed. Neither state felt irrational From the inside, that was the unsettling part. Altered perception rarely announces itself as altered. At night, this feels less like condemnation and more like recognition. Many of us know what it means to feel sharper or braver after a drink, or calmer after something that dulls the edges of thought. The difference is scale. A personal choice becomes historical consequence when attached to a crown. The king trusted the mixture because it trusted him back. At least it seemed to. It did not challenge, it did not argue, it adjusted the world to feel more manageable. That was valuable. A ruler did not have the luxury of stopping to process uncertainty. Action mattered more than reflection. The mixture shortened the distance between impulse and decision. There is a quiet humor in imagining grand strategies emerging from rooms scented with resins and smoke. The serious language of statecraft delivered by a man whose perception had been gently rearranged by chemistry. The contradiction was invisible to those living inside it. Only later does it stand out. The physicians were not villains. They believed deeply in their craft. They recorded effects. They adjusted ingredients. They shared notes with colleagues in other courts. This was knowledge moving slowly through experimentation. Failures were rarely documented. Successes were remembered generously. Alchemy thrived because it offered hope. Not hope of transcendence, but hope of control. If the mind could be tuned like an instrument, then perhaps chaos could be kept at bay. Kings embraced this idea because chaos was their constant companion. Anything that promised even temporary order was worth trying. Night after night the pattern repeated. Counsel by day, mixture by night. A cycle that blurred lines between intention and reaction. The king woke believing himself decisive, and often he was. Whether that decisiveness led toward stability or turmoil depended on variables far beyond any cabinet. Late-night history does not rush to judge this. It watches. It notices how power adjusts itself to human limits. The mixture was not indulgence, it was infrastructure, an unspoken support system for a role that demanded more than anybody could naturally give. The unsettling part is not that rulers relied on these substances, it is that they had little alternative. Rest was fragmented, trust was rare, solitude was dangerous. The mixture offered a controlled retreat, a way to step back without stepping down. As the night deepened, the king would often sit alone with the after effects. Thoughts drifting, confidence swelling or softening, plans feeling clearer than they might have been in daylight. The world simplified. Complex alliances reduced to manageable shapes. This felt like mastery. In truth, it was narrowing. History moved forward anyway. It always does. The mixture did not halt time. It simply colored it. Decisions were made. Armies moved. Laws changed. And beneath it all, the quiet presence of altered perception remained unacknowledged. When the cabinet closed and the candle burned low, the king rested in a space between certainty and sleep. Enough awareness to remain in control, enough distance to feel relief. The court would adjust in the morning. They always did. And so the cabinet that once served a queen continued its work. Different ruler, similar need. The night did not discriminate. It accepted all who came seeking quiet. Power passed. The mixture remained. History continued its uneven march, guided not only by ambition and strategy, but by chemistry, fatigue, and the human desire to feel steady when the world refused to be. In the end, this is not a story about excess. It is a story about adaptation, about how authority learned to survive inside fragile bodies. Late at night, when clarity softens and certainty loosens, that truth feels less distant, less historical, more familiar. The mixture did not satisfy every ruler. Some accepted calm and moved on. Others felt a different pull. Once the cabinet had softened the edges of the world, curiosity crept in. Not the restless kind that demands answers, but the slower curiosity that wonders what else the mind might do if given room. This is where the scholar entered the story. Not always a separate figure, sometimes the ruler himself, leaning closer to the unknown with the quiet confidence of someone who believed thought could be stretched without breaking. Night was the proper hour for this. Daytime belonged to order and repetition. Night allowed wandering. Lamps glowed low. Scrolls waited unread. The air thickened with scent. Knowledge at this hour was not gathered aggressively. It drifted. It settled. It lingered longer than expected. Scholars of the court were not confined to books. They were collectors of experience. They observed how the body responded to the world and how the mind responded to alteration. They spoke in careful language about perception and balance. In practice, they were testing limits, not out of recklessness, but fascination. If thought could be nudged gently, perhaps understanding would follow. Incense was the most polite introduction. It asked nothing dramatic. Smoke rose slowly, filling chambers with layered scents that shifted as they warmed. Resin softened the air. Oils released their weight gradually. Breathing changed without announcement. Conversation slowed. Attention narrowed, then widened again in unexpected ways. This was not intoxication in the modern sense. It was atmosphere as method. An emperor inclined toward learning found this irresistible. He had already mastered command and ritual. Now the mind itself became territory. Scholars arrived with jars and burners and quiet enthusiasm. They spoke of focus, of clarity, of calming the inner noise that interrupted thought. They rarely promised visions. They promised concentration. That was more respectable. The irony was subtle and persistent. The more the mind relaxed, the more it wandered. An idea would be followed to its edges and then drift beyond them. Discussions extended long past their original subject. Philosophy blended into observation, observation into speculation. The emperor listened with fascination, occasionally forgetting why the meeting had begun at all. Courtiers learned patience. When the room smelled faintly sweet and the emperor leaned back in his chair, they knew this was not the hour for logistics. Numbers would wait. Administration could return with the morning light. Tonight belonged to questions that did not require answers. Scholars recorded impressions carefully. How long the scent lingered, how the mind responded, whether attention sharpened or softened. They believed they were mapping cognition. In reality, they were mapping mood. Both felt useful. The distinction was not yet important. There is a quiet humor in imagining laws and philosophies gestating in rooms filled with fragrant haze. Serious men debating structure and order while their senses drifted gently away from the physical world. It was not incompetence, it was confidence. Confidence that insight arrived more easily when the mind loosened its grip. The emperor participated fully. He was not a passive subject. He asked what would happen if the mixture were adjusted. More resin, different oil, longer exposure. Scholars hesitated only briefly. Curiosity flowed downward in a court. Refusal required courage. few possessed. And so the experiments continued. The effects were not dramatic, no sudden revelations. Instead, there was a gradual shift. Time stretched, thoughts layered. The emperor became absorbed in minor details, the way light caught on stone, the rhythm of his own breathing. These moments were interpreted as depth, and perhaps they were. Depth does not always lead outward. Sometimes it leads inward and stays there. Meetings began to adapt. Advisors waited for cues. When the emperor entered quietly and spoke slowly, discussions turned abstract. When his focus narrowed intensely on a single idea, they followed that path regardless of practicality. The court learned that logic did not disappear under these conditions. It simply reorganized itself. Late-night history finds this fascinating. The pursuit of understanding did not require sobriety, as later centuries would define it. It required engagement, presence, a willingness to let the mind move differently. Scholars believed altered states revealed truths hidden from ordinary perception. The emperor believed them because they sounded convincing and felt productive. It is unsettling only because we prefer the image of rational control. The reality was softer. Knowledge advanced through wandering as much as through discipline. Insights emerged from conversations that drifted and returned, changed. Not every conclusion survived daylight. Enough did to keep the process respected. The scent became associated with seriousness. A room prepared for thinking smelled a certain way. Smoke was not indulgence, it was signal. The emperor was engaged in work of the mind. Courtiers lowered their voices. Scholars leaned closer. This atmosphere reinforced itself. There were nights when thought dissolved entirely, when attention slipped away, and the emperor sat quietly, fingers resting on the arm of his chair, eyes unfocused. Scholars noted this as rest, a mind unburdened by direction. They believed this too had value. A rested mind returned sharper, or at least more willing. Humor crept in unnoticed. The emperor once listened intently to a long explanation of cosmic order, only to ask at the end whether anyone else felt the room breathing. The scholars exchanged glances and continued as though this were a reasonable observation. In that moment it was. The line between exploration and distraction was thin. It shifted constantly, yet the court functioned. Decisions were made eventually. Knowledge accumulated in fragments. The emperor's reputation as a thinker grew. People spoke of his depth. Few asked how that depth was reached. This was not decadence, it was method. A method shaped by the limits of human attention and the belief that understanding required altered perspective. In the quiet of night, this feels less strange. Many of us have known insights arrive when control loosens, when effort relaxes, when the mind drifts just far enough to see differently. The scholar followed the smoke because it led away from rigidity. Books alone could not provide that. Experience was needed. Sensation. The slow reshaping of awareness. An emperor willing to participate was a gift. He offered his own mind as laboratory. Late-night history does not decide whether this was wise. It observes how knowledge grew in these conditions, not cleanly, not linearly, but persistently. Thought expanded sideways. Understanding arrived unevenly. Yet it arrived. When the night ended and the scent faded, the emperor returned to daylight tasks with fragments of insight. Some proved useful, others dissolved. The process continued regardless. The cabinet held mixtures for calming. The burners waited for curiosity. And so the story moves forward from confidence to exploration, from control to wandering. The queen sought quiet. The king trusted strength. The scholar followed the smoke. Each step made sense in its moment. Each left traces that shaped decisions larger than the rooms in which they were made. As the night deepens again, this pattern feels familiar. We search for calm. We search for certainty. Eventually we search for understanding. Often in that order, history followed the same rhythm, softened by fatigue, guided by curiosity, and occasionally led astray by the belief that a mind made lighter will always see more clearly. The smoke thinned, the lamps dimmed, the emperor rested in thought rather than sleep. Scholars packed their jars with quiet satisfaction. Knowledge had moved a little, no one could say exactly where, but movement itself felt like progress. And in the long, quiet stretch of history, that was often enough. The smoke did not remain a private experiment for long. What began in small chambers followed curiosity outward, spreading gently through corridors and halls. The scholar had followed the smoke in search of understanding, but the palace itself soon followed for simpler reasons. Scent was calming, calm was useful, and usefulness has a way of becoming routine. By the time anyone noticed, the air of the palace had changed. Not dramatically, just enough to feel different, enough to feel managed. There was no announcement, no decree stating that the palace would now breathe differently. It simply happened. Burners appeared where torches once stood alone. Oils were added to baths and floors. Curtains absorbed aroma and released it slowly back into the rooms. Visitors noticed first. Residents adjusted without comment. What had once been atmosphere became environment. This was not indulgence, it was logistics. A palace was crowded with tension. Rivalries moved quietly through rooms. Messages arrived carrying problems rather than solutions. Diplomacy required patience that few possessed naturally. If the air could help soften reactions, then the air would be used. Ambassadors entered halls already carrying their own expectations and anxieties. By the time they reached the throne room, something subtle had shifted. The scent was unfamiliar, heavy but not unpleasant. It slowed breathing. It made voices drop in volume. A negotiation that might have begun sharply instead unfolded with measured pauses. No one pointed to the air as the reason. That would have been impolite. Instead, they praised the calm presence of the court. The palace learned that atmosphere shaped behavior. Words arrived differently when spoken in scented rooms. Tempers rose more slowly. Offense took longer to form. This was not wisdom, it was chemistry meeting habit. Over time, it felt natural. A palace without scent began to feel unfinished. The irony settled in quietly. Outsiders spoke of the court as serene, of rulers who seemed unshakable. They attributed this to discipline or culture. In reality, it was familiarity. When you live inside a certain sensory state long enough, it stops feeling altered. It becomes baseline. Calm does not feel earned. It feels normal. Court life adapted around this new normal. Meetings extended without fatigue becoming visible. Long discussions unfolded with fewer interruptions. Silence became acceptable rather than awkward. When disagreements arose, they did so with softened edges. The palace did not eliminate conflict. It slowed it. There is something gently unsettling about this. Power was not only enforced through authority or ritual, it was supported by atmosphere. The air itself became part of governance, not through manipulation in the dramatic sense, but through maintenance. Keep the environment steady, and people will follow. Bathing rituals deepened the effect. Steam carried oils upward, the body relaxed before the mind noticed. Muscles loosened, breathing lengthened. Officials emerged calmer than they had entered. No one spoke of this as influence. It was simply preparation, a readying of the body for the demands ahead. Over time, the palace became accustomed to its own haze. Windows were opened less often. Fresh air was appreciated but not necessary. The scent marked belonging. Those who lived within it felt centered. Those who left noticed the difference immediately. The world outside felt sharper, louder, less forgiving. Visitors from other courts returned home carrying impressions they could not quite articulate. Something about that palace lingered. They spoke of its tranquility, its measured pace. They tried to replicate it with mixed success. Without the habit, the effect was temporary. Calm requires consistency. Diplomacy thrived in this environment, not because agreements were wiser, but because resistance softened. Saying no required effort. Saying yes felt easier. Ambassadors who stayed longer found themselves more agreeable than expected. They returned home slightly surprised by their own concessions. Late-night history finds humor here. Treaties shaped under conditions resembling an extended scented bath. Decisions praised for their balance may have owed as much to atmosphere as insight. Yet no one considered this improper. It was simply how things were done. The palace did not think of itself as altered. It thought of itself as refined. Refinement included comfort. Comfort included scent. Over time, this logic hardened into tradition. New generations grew up breathing the same air. They learned politics within it. Their baseline expectations formed accordingly. This is where the unsettling calm deepens. When an environment shapes perception long enough, its influence disappears from awareness. The palace felt steady because it was designed to feel steady. Those raised within it believed this steadiness came from character. The air did not argue. Critics existed quietly. Some noted that urgency faded too easily, that caution felt less sharp, but they struggled to articulate this without sounding unreasonable. Calm is difficult to criticize without appearing disruptive. The palace rewarded those who matched its pace. Humor surfaced occasionally in private remarks. A visiting official once joked that the palace seemed to exhale collectively when discussions grew tense. Another wondered aloud whether decisions would change if everyone took a walk outside. These comments were laughed off gently and forgotten. The scent became associated with authority. To smell it was to be close to power. Offices nearer the central halls carried stronger notes. Outer rooms felt thinner. Access could be sensed as much as seen. The palace organized itself by aroma as much as by architecture. Late at night, the effect intensified. Burners were refreshed. Curtains released the day's absorbed scent back into the rooms. The palace felt almost alive, breathing slowly, settling into itself. Rulers walked its halls, feeling held rather than burdened. This was not enlightenment. It was familiarity. The calm did not arise from deep understanding. It arose from repetition, from bodies learning how to exist comfortably within a specific sensory range. The palace did not seek truth. It sought continuity. And continuity it achieved. Crises were absorbed rather than confronted. Conflicts stretched out until they softened. This worked until it did not. When sharp action was required, the palace hesitated. Calm had trained it well for patience, less so for urgency. History would later debate the wisdom of such environments. From the inside there was no debate. The palace functioned. That was enough. Results were mixed, as they always are. The air did not guarantee success. It guaranteed steadiness. As the night deepens, this pattern feels strangely modern. Many spaces today are curated for calm. Soft lighting, controlled sound, carefully chosen scent. We do this not to deceive, but to cope. The palace learned this early. It built coping into its walls. The scholar followed the smoke seeking insight. The palace followed it seeking stability. Both found what they were looking for, at least temporarily. Knowledge drifted, power settled. The air grew thick with habit. When the lamps dimmed and the halls emptied, the palace rested in its familiar haze. Not dreaming, not thinking, simply continuing, ready to shape another day, quietly. Late-night history lingers here because it reveals something simple and unsettling. Control does not always arrive through force or brilliance. Sometimes it arrives through comfort repeated until it feels inevitable. The palace learned to breathe. And in doing so, it taught everyone inside it how to slow down without noticing why. The smoke thinned toward morning. Windows opened slightly. The world outside waited. Inside, the palace remained calm, familiar, certain of its own atmosphere, and history continued, shaped as much by the air people breathed as by the words they spoke. There is a certain hour of the night when history feels less confident. The grand stories soften, sharp edges blur. What remains is not triumph or catastrophe, but people, breathing, waiting, enduring. This is the hour when power feels heavy rather than heroic, when decisions seem less inspired and more exhausted. Late-night history lives here. It does not accuse, it observes. It notices how often control was not enforced with chains or soldiers, but with quietness, with stillness, with the expectation that unrest itself was the problem. And if unrest could be softened, then order would follow. Instability has never been a neutral word. In courts and palaces, it carried a particular danger. A ruler who was described as unsettled invited scrutiny. For women in positions of power, this scrutiny arrived faster and lingered longer. Emotion was not interpreted as response. It was labeled condition. Disagreement was not strategy. It was disturbance. And disturbance demanded correction. Medicine offered a convenient language for this. It allowed control to present itself as care. The vocabulary was gentle, calming, balancing, restorative. But the effect was often silence, a quieter presence, slower reactions, less resistance. When a powerful woman challenged those around her, the question was rarely whether she was right. The question became whether she was well. Physicians entered the conversation not as adversaries, but as helpers. They did not need to argue politics. They only needed to observe behavior. Sleeplessness became symptom. Frustration became agitation. Grief became excess. Each response to pressure could be translated into imbalance, and imbalance had remedies. These remedies were rarely optional. They arrived with authority. A cup offered at the right moment, a draft prepared in advance, a treatment explained patiently while decisions were postponed. The woman did not need to refuse openly. Compliance was framed as cooperation. Resistance only confirmed the diagnosis. There is a quiet irony here. The very qualities required to hold power, awareness, intensity, emotional range, were the same qualities labeled dangerous when expressed. Medicine did not erase these traits. It softened their visibility. The goal was not healing. It was manageability. Late night history finds this pattern unsettling, not because it is cruel, but because it is effective. Sedation does not look like violence, it looks like rest, a slowed voice, a composed posture. To observers, this appeared as improvement. The woman seemed calmer, easier to work with, less volatile. The system congratulated itself. Meanwhile, decision-making shifted, not dramatically, gradually. Sharp objections dulled, urgency faded. The sense that something was wrong retreated into the background. The world did not become better, it became quieter. This quiet was praised. Calmness became evidence of fitness. The irony was complete. The more medicated the woman became, the more proof there was that treatment was necessary. Any moment of clarity or resistance was reinterpreted as relapse. The cycle sustained itself without needing malice. Humor appears here only if one allows it to. The court that feared instability responded by creating it chemically. A leader described as erratic became genuinely disoriented. Confusion replaced anger. Fatigue replaced resolve. And this outcome was documented as success. Men in similar positions were not immune to medication, but the framing differed. Their treatments aimed to restore strength or focus. Women were treated to restore quiet. The distinction was rarely stated. It did not need to be. Everyone understood it. Night after night, the pattern repeated. A woman spoke too sharply. A concern was raised about her health. A physician arrived. The remedy worked quickly. The room relaxed. Discussions moved on. History advanced without her interruption. Late-night history does not dramatize this. It lingers on the small details. The way a cup was placed within reach. The way conversation slowed while waiting for its effect. The way decisions resumed once the room felt stable again. Stability was not truth. It was comfort. There is something deeply human about this mechanism. Societies have always struggled with discomfort. They prefer solutions that reduce sensation rather than address cause. Medicine provided a respectable way to do this. It allowed power to maintain its image while avoiding confrontation. The unsettling part is how easily care and control merge. The physician believed in his craft. The advisors believed they were preserving order. The woman herself may have welcomed relief. Fatigue makes resistance expensive. Relief feels kind even when it costs clarity. Late at night, this feels familiar. Many people know the temptation to quiet their own unrest, to choose numbness over struggle. The difference is agency. In these historical moments, the choice was rarely fully hers. The record left behind is quiet. Documents describe periods of rest, of improved demeanor, of reduced disturbance. What they do not describe is the cost. The ideas left unspoken, the warnings softened before they could land. The perspective removed from the table not by debate, but by chemistry. Late-night history does not shout this truth. It does not need to. It lets it settle. Control does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like a pillow placed gently over awareness. And yet the system relied on this method repeatedly because it worked. Calm rooms are easier to govern. Silent leaders are easier to manage. Medicine became a tool not of healing, but of alignment. As the night deepens, the image grows clearer. A powerful woman sitting quietly while others speak for her, not because she lacks thought, but because thought has been slowed. The room interprets this as peace. History moves forward on these moments, not with dramatic falls, but with gradual narrowing. Possibility reduced to acceptability. Dissent transformed into diagnosis. When morning arrives, the treatment is recorded as successful. The woman appears composed. The court appears stable. The cost is invisible. Late night history remains here because this pattern did not belong to one place or one era. It repeats whenever discomfort is framed as illness and silence as cure. It repeats whenever calm is valued more than truth. The night does not resolve this. It simply holds it, quietly, uncomfortably, and lets you rest with the understanding that history was often shaped not by loud acts of control, but by gentle ones. Insomnia does not announce itself as a crisis. It arrives quietly and stays longer than expected. At first, it looks like dedication. Long nights spent awake feel productive, thoughtful, serious. Over time, the body disagrees, the mind slows, the edges blur. Late night history is familiar with this state. Many decisions that shaped the past were made by people who had not slept properly in years, not because they chose wakefulness, but because power rarely allows rest. When calm became a requirement, sleep became a problem to manage rather than a rhythm to respect. At court, insomnia was never treated as a personal issue. It was political. A ruler who did not sleep did not think clearly. A ruler who did not think clearly made unpredictable choices. Unpredictability frightened everyone, ministers, advisors, physicians, not because chaos followed immediately, but because it might. And in politics, the possibility of disruption is often treated as disruption itself. Sleep was therefore not private. It was monitored, discussed, addressed. A restless night became a topic of concern the following morning. Dark circles under the eyes were noticed. A pause before answering a question drew glances. Fatigue was read as instability, and instability demanded intervention. The language remained gentle, always gentle. The ruler was tired. The ruler needed rest. The ruler deserved relief. No one framed it as control. That would have been rude. Instead, it was care, practical, responsible, necessary. The body was failing to do what was required of it. Medicine would assist. Poppy milk was a favorite. It carried no drama in the way it was described, just a soothing preparation. Warm, familiar, something that had been used for generations. It promised sleep without struggle, a soft descent into unconsciousness. It was offered as kindness and often received as such. Sleep wine followed, stronger, more decisive, less concerned with nuance. It blurred the night quickly, thoughts slowed, muscles relaxed. The mind stopped resisting. For a ruler whose nights had become endless loops of worry and anticipation, this felt like rescue. The night finally ended. No one lingered on the after effects. Morning grogginess was expected. A slight dullness was preferable to the sharp unpredictability of exhaustion. The court adjusted. Meetings were delayed. Important decisions postponed until the ruler appeared steady enough. Steady did not mean alert. It meant manageable. Over time, stronger mixtures entered the routine. The nights had grown stubborn. The body had learned to resist gentle persuasion. What once worked now failed. Physicians adjusted their approach. They spoke of tolerance, of balance, of the need to restore natural rhythms. In practice, this meant increasing force. The irony here is subtle. Sleep was imposed in order to preserve clarity, yet the sleep achieved was not restorative. It was enforced, heavy, lingering. The ruler woke, but did not fully return. Days passed in a haze. Decisions were made slowly, reactions dulled. This state was interpreted as calm, Late night history pauses here. Calm achieved through exhaustion, followed by sedation, is not rest. It is compliance. But compliance was valuable. A ruler who moved slowly was less dangerous than one who acted impulsively. The court learned to prefer this version. Insomnia thus transformed from a personal struggle into a tool. Sleeplessness created vulnerability. Medication resolved it in a way that served the system. The ruler slept. The court relaxed. Order appeared to hold. There is a dark humor in imagining great policies shaped during mornings that followed chemically heavy nights. The language of governance delivered through thick thought. Advisors repeating points gently until they landed. Opposition softened by fatigue. The ruler nodding more often than objecting. Stability achieved through weariness. This was not cruelty in the obvious sense. No one set out to diminish the ruler. They set out to protect the realm. Insomnia was framed as threat. Forced sleep as solution. The cost was not calculated because it was invisible. The realm continued. That was proof enough. Night after night the pattern repeated. Restlessness, concern, intervention, sleep, grogginess, calm. The ruler lived in an extended twilight, not fully awake, not fully unconscious, a state that felt strangely appropriate for someone whose role demanded constant vigilance without reaction. The body adapted. It learned to expect assistance. Natural sleep became rarer. Without preparation, the night felt hostile. The mind raced. Anxiety returned sharper than before. This confirmed the need for continued treatment. Dependence formed quietly, without accusation, without intention. Late-night history recognizes this mechanism because it repeats across eras. Insomnia is rarely tolerated in positions of power. It is treated, managed, contained, not because rest is valued, but because unrest is feared. The ruler was not the only one affected. The court adjusted its rhythm to match. Mornings grew slower, afternoons extended. Decisions migrated to late hours when the ruler seemed most composed. The entire system bent around an altered sleep cycle. This adaptation was praised as flexibility. In truth, it was accommodation. The realm learned to function around a leader who lived in a prolonged state of half-awareness. Not incapacitated, simply softened. Humor surfaces again, if one allows it. Meetings celebrated for their civility may have owed more to poppy milk than diplomacy. Conflicts, described as resolved, might simply have been postponed until everyone forgot why they mattered. Fatigue has a way of reducing urgency. Insomnia remained a recurring concern. Nights grew unpredictable. Some passed easily under chemical guidance. Others resisted. Physicians spoke of stubborn humors, of bodies refusing to align. The ruler endured treatments patiently. Resistance felt pointless. Relief was too valuable. At no point was the question asked whether the role itself was incompatible with rest. That would have been inconvenient. Instead, the body was adjusted to fit the role. Sleep was shaped to serve governance rather than the other way around. Late-night history does not frame this as failure. It frames it as compromise. A society choosing control over restoration, predictability over vitality, calm over clarity. As years passed, the ruler aged faster than expected, not visibly at first. The decline was subtle, memory slowed, curiosity faded, risk aversion increased. These changes were interpreted as wisdom, maturity, the calm of experience. The court praised this transformation. The ruler had become steady, reliable, less volatile. Insomnia seemed resolved. Nights were quiet, days were slow. Stability reigned. Only occasionally did someone notice the absence of something. Sharp insight, decisive energy, the spark that once drove bold action. These losses were accepted as natural. Age, responsibility, time. No one traced them back to years of enforced sleep. Late-night history lingers on this because it reveals a pattern that feels familiar. When discomfort threatens order, systems often choose sedation over change. Sleep becomes something to impose rather than allow. Insomnia becomes a political problem rather than a human one. The night never truly ended for this ruler. It was interrupted, broken, managed. The body never learned to trust rest again. Sleep became something that happened to them, not something they entered willingly. As the final years approached, the treatments intensified. The body resisted less. Consciousness thinned. The ruler remained present enough to fulfill the role. That was sufficient. The realm continued. Succession prepared quietly. Late-night history does not end this story with tragedy. It ends with quiet continuation. The ruler slept, the court functioned, the system survived. What lingers is the unsettling calm, the realization that some of history's most stable periods may have been built on exhaustion and enforced rest. That calm often came not from harmony, but from dullness. As the night deepens again, this story rests beside the previous one. Calm became a requirement. Insomnia became a threat. Sleep became a tool. The ruler closed their eyes because they were told to. The night obliged. Morning returned without clarity, and history moved forward in a softened state, guided not by wakefulness or rest, but by something in between. Late-night history allows this thought to settle without resolution. It does not demand judgment. It simply notices how often power preferred quiet minds to awake ones, and how often the night was never allowed to end. War rarely announces itself with clarity. It arrives through fatigue first. Before banners and clashes, there are bodies already worn down, long marches, heavy equipment, cold nights spent half listening for danger. By the time battle begins, few are fully present. Late-night history understands this. It does not imagine warriors as sharp instruments waiting for purpose. It sees them as human forms, already strained, already hurting, already searching for something that makes the pain tolerable. This is where ancient relief enters quietly, not as luxury, but as necessity. The battlefield was not a place for full awareness. That idea belongs to later stories. Ancient war demanded endurance more than precision. Wounds were expected, bruises layered over older bruises, cuts reopened before they healed. Pain did not signal retreat. It signaled continuation. A soldier who could still stand was considered functional. How he felt was secondary. Opium was not rare or scandalous. It was practical. It traveled well. It acted quickly. It softened the edges of suffering just enough to keep bodies moving. In camps, it was shared without ceremony. A paste, a drink, a small portion passed quietly between hands. There was no debate about morality. The question was simple. Could you keep going? Battlefields were loud but strangely detached. A warrior dulled by pain relief moved differently. Reactions slowed. Fear lost its sharpness. This was not courage in the heroic sense. It was distance. Distance from the body. Distance from the immediate consequences of injury. Awareness narrowed to motion and survival. Late-night history finds an unsettling calm here. War required bodies that functioned despite damage. Pain relief made that possible, not by healing wounds, but by allowing the wounded to remain useful. The goal was not comfort. It was continuation. Physicians followed armies for this reason, not to cure, to manage. Their work was efficient rather than compassionate. Stop bleeding, reduce agony, keep the soldier conscious enough to obey. Relief was measured carefully. Too much dulled movement, too little risked collapse. This balance was learned through repetition, not theory. There is dark humor in imagining ancient strategy unfolding among men whose senses were partially muted, commands shouted to ears already ringing, plans executed by bodies operating on habit rather than clarity. Histories later praised discipline and coordination. They rarely mentioned how much was achieved through reduced sensation. Pain relief also shaped memory. Warriors returned from battle with gaps. Events felt distant. Trauma softened into haze. This was not intentional therapy. It was a side effect. The body remembered enough to remain cautious. The mind forgot enough to continue. Injuries were constant companions. A soldier might fight with an infected wound for weeks. Relief allowed this. It kept pain from overwhelming function. The wound became background noise rather than emergency. This did not end well for everyone. Many died later from complications. On the battlefield, later was acceptable. Alertness was not the priority modern minds expect. A fully alert soldier felt everything: fear, pain, doubt. A dulled soldier felt less. He followed orders more smoothly. He moved when told. This was valued. Commanders learned this without formal study. They observed outcomes. Nighttime camps revealed the cost. Groans softened by substances. Fires burned low. Bodies lay still in states that resembled sleep but were something else entirely. Consciousness retreated unevenly. Some men slept deeply. Others drifted in and out. Dreams blurred with memory. The night absorbed them. Late-night history lingers here because it challenges the idea of noble suffering. Ancient warfare did not glorify pain. It sought to suppress it. The heroic narrative came later. In the moment, survival mattered more than honor. The battlefield also taught a different relationship to the body. Pain became negotiable, something to manage rather than heed. This mindset followed soldiers home. Old injuries flared. Relief was sought again. Habits formed quietly. The body learned that discomfort could be postponed. Humor slips in quietly. A commander once praised the calm discipline of his troops after a brutal clash. What he observed was not discipline. It was exhaustion combined with relief. Calm arrived because sensation had been lowered. The distinction mattered little at the time. Pain relief equalized experience. Rank mattered less when everyone hurt. Relief passed between soldiers without ceremony. In that moment, hierarchy softened. Survival was shared. The substance did not care who received it. It acted the same. Late-night history notices how this practice shaped later expectations. Soldiers accustomed to relief expected it. Without it, the body rebelled. Pain felt sharper. Fear returned more vividly. Commanders recognized this quickly. Supplies adjusted. Relief became part of logistics. This was not addiction in the modern sense. It was dependence born of necessity. War created conditions that demanded it. The substance answered those demands. Judgment was irrelevant. Effectiveness ruled. Battlefields were never clean or controlled. Chaos ruled. Relief offered a thin layer of order, a way to regulate bodies when the environment could not be regulated. It made violence sustainable. The unsettling calm emerges again. War continued not because men were fearless, but because fear was muted. Pain was dulled. Awareness narrowed. This allowed conflict to persist longer than raw human tolerance would permit. Late-night history does not condemn this. It observes it. Humans have always sought ways to continue when continuation was demanded. Ancient relief was one of those ways. After battle, the wounded were treated with the same logic: reduce pain, prevent immediate collapse. Long-term outcome was secondary. Many lived, many did not. Relief did not promise recovery. It promised time. Time mattered. Time allowed armies to regroup. Time allowed wounded soldiers to be counted as living rather than lost. Time allowed the system to function. As nights passed in camps, the routine continued. A portion, a pause, a quiet settling. Fires dimmed. Bodies sank into uneven rest. The night carried their pain for them temporarily. Late-night history stays with these nights because they reveal the truth beneath heroic language. War was fought by tired bodies using whatever means allowed them to endure. Relief was not weakness. It was infrastructure. When dawn arrived, soldiers rose slowly, movements stiff, senses dulled, orders given, motion resumed. Pain returned gradually. Relief would follow again when needed. The cycle sustained itself. This pattern repeated across eras and regions. Different substances, same purpose: to keep the body moving when the mind wanted to stop. The unsettling part is not the use of relief. It is how normal it was, how essential, how invisible in later retellings. War was never fought fully awake. It was fought in a state between awareness and numbness. Late-night history allows this truth to sit quietly, without drama, without judgment. It simply notes that ancient pain relief made violence possible at a scale the naked human body could not endure. As the night deepens, this understanding settles gently. The warriors were not fearless. They were managed, their pain negotiated, their awareness shaped, and history moved forward, not on sharp minds alone, but on bodies allowed to hurt less than they otherwise would. It was endured in fragments of awareness. When we move past that thought, we arrive somewhere colder and more intimate, the place where courage is often praised, but sensation has quietly stepped aside. Late-night history prefers this corner, not the shout of bravery, but the stillness that makes bravery possible. Before we continue, allow the room to stay dim. Let the edges soften. This is not a story meant to keep you alert. It is meant to explain why alertness was often the first thing to disappear. Courage, in many historical accounts, is described as a moral quality, a choice, a strength of will. Yet the records quietly suggest something else. Many soldiers did not advance because they felt fearless. They advanced because their bodies no longer fully reported what was happening. Pain arrived late. Fear arrived distorted. Sensation arrived softened, as if filtered through thick cloth. This was not always accidental. Ancient and medieval warfare demanded proximity. Blades required closeness. Shields required pressure. Armor required endurance. A fully awake body would hesitate. A body dulled by exhaustion, injury, or substances moved more steadily. Less questioning, less interruption. Late-night history notices that bravery often coincided with numbness. When accounts describe calm under fire, they rarely describe clarity. They describe silence, a narrowing of the world, a shrinking of sensation until only motion remained. Soldiers learned quickly that feeling everything was dangerous. Pain distracted. Fear disrupted formation. Awareness slowed reaction. The ideal body was not fearless. It was quiet. This quiet was cultivated long before the first clash. Marches lasted days. Sleep thinned. Hunger dulled edges. Injuries accumulated. Treatments followed, not to restore, but to mute. Relief came not as healing, but as permission to continue. There is mild irony in how courage is celebrated without acknowledging this preparation. We imagine bold decisions made in full awareness. In reality, many decisions were made in partial sensation. The body was present. The mind hovered nearby. This does not diminish what was done. It reframes it. Endurance was less about moral superiority and more about altered perception. The world felt farther away. Pain became negotiable. Late-night history finds this unsettling because it blurs the line between bravery and impairment. When sensation is reduced, danger loses its sharpness. Fear becomes abstract. The body moves because it has been trained to move through reduced input. This was useful. Empires noticed. As wars expanded, methods refined. The goal was not to eliminate pain, but to manage it. Enough sensation to function, not enough to stop. Courage became a side effect of this balance. Accounts of soldiers standing firm under impossible conditions often include quiet details. They felt distant, time slowed, sounds flattened. These are not descriptions of moral clarity. They are descriptions of dissociation. Late-night history does not judge this, it observes it. The human nervous system is remarkably adaptable. Under sustained stress, it protects itself by narrowing awareness. What remains is action. Humor slips in gently here. Generals praised bravery without needing to understand the biology behind it. Philosophers debated courage while bodies simply adapted. The body did not wait for theory, it adjusted. Pain relief substances played their part. Taken before battle, after injury, or during recovery, they shaped perception. They softened edges. They reduced hesitation. They did not create heroes. They created operable bodies. This raises an uncomfortable question that late-night history does not ask out loud. It simply lets it sit. How much of what we call courage is actually the absence of full sensation? Marching into danger feels different when danger feels distant. Soldiers who survived often struggled afterward. In quieter settings, sensation returned. Fear arrived late, pain resurfaced. The calm that once allowed action became intrusive silence. Courage did not translate well to peace. Late-night history lingers here because this is where myths begin to fray. The brave warrior returning home often found himself overwhelmed not by memory alone, but by sensation itself. The body remembered how to be quiet. The world no longer required it. There is something gently tragic in this. Courage demanded numbness. Survival demanded it continue. Peace offered no clear instruction for reversal. Historical records describe veterans as restless, detached, or unresponsive. They had learned to function with reduced input. Normal life felt loud, sharp, unfiltered. This pattern repeated across centuries. Different weapons, same nervous systems. Empires benefited from this adaptation. Calm soldiers were reliable, quiet bodies were efficient, bravery became predictable. Late-night history smiles faintly at how often this was misunderstood. Leaders spoke of honor, bodies spoke of chemistry. The two rarely aligned, but the outcome served authority. Courage was easier to command when it required less feeling. The unsettling calm deepens when we realize how normalized this became. Training did not aim to inspire fearlessness. It aimed to suppress sensation. Drill repeated until reaction replaced thought. Exhaustion ensured compliance. Relief ensured continuation. The body learned to obey before the mind could object. This is not a condemnation. It is a recognition of scale. Large conflicts require bodies that can endure what minds would resist. Courage became the story we told afterward. Late-night history notices how language cleans this up. Words like valor and honor float comfortably above the physical reality. Below them are bodies negotiating pain, awareness, and survival. Even jokes appear in the margins. Soldiers joked about not feeling their legs, about time slowing, about moving on instinct alone. Humor softened what language could not. As the night stretches, this understanding settles. Courage was not always loud. Often it was quiet, sometimes frighteningly so. The body did what it had to do. When wars ended, that quiet lingered. Some carried it for life. Others sought ways to recreate it. Stillness felt safer than full awareness. Late-night history does not rush to resolve this. There is no neat lesson, only a pattern repeated often enough to be recognizable. War was never fought awake, because being fully awake would have made it unbearable. Courage emerged not from heightened awareness, but from its temporary suspension. As you rest with this thought, notice how calm can be unsettling. Silence can be functional. Stillness can hide effort. History moves forward not only on ideals, but on bodies that learned how to quiet themselves long enough to carry those ideals into motion. Late-night history lets the room remain dim. The story does not demand attention. It waits quietly, much like the bodies that once carried it. History often presents power as something abstract, a crown, a banner, a border drawn with confidence. Late-night history prefers to look elsewhere. It looks at the body that carries power from one place to another, the body that learns, the body that adapts, the body that becomes dangerous not because it is strong, but because it understands. Before this story settles in, let the pace slow. This is not the tale of conquest shouted across marble halls. It is the quieter moment when power passes through muscle, breath, and memory. When empire believes it is shaping people, and one person quietly learns how the shape works. Arminius did not begin as a rebel. He began as a student. Taken young from the forests of his homeland, he was brought into the interior of a system that believed proximity guaranteed loyalty. Empires often mistake exposure for conversion. Teach someone your language, your customs, your discipline, and they will become yours. This belief has comforted administrators for centuries. Arminius learned everything offered to him. He learned how legions moved across open ground, how camps were built with mechanical precision, how orders traveled from mouth to mouth until thousands moved as one. He learned hierarchy, reward, punishment, and most importantly, confidence. Roman confidence was a physical thing. It lived in posture, in routine, in the way officers assumed the world would behave. Late-night history finds something unsettling here. Education was meant to soften him. Instead, it sharpened him. Knowledge did not dissolve his identity, it layered over it. The empire believed the body could be retrained, that habits could replace memory, that comfort would erase origin. Arminius demonstrated the flaw in this thinking. The body remembers more than instruction accounts for. He moved through Roman spaces with ease. ate their food, spoke their language, wore their armor, the empire saw success, a foreign body functioning correctly within imperial systems, the proof of civilization. What they missed was the quiet observation happening underneath. Arminius was not absorbing loyalty, he was absorbing structure. He was learning how power moved when it felt unchallenged. Late-night history pauses here because this is where power often fails. It assumes understanding leads to obedience. It forgets that understanding can lead to strategy. Arminius learned how authority relaxes when it feels secure, how officers trusted maps over terrain, how discipline depended on predictability, how systems designed for open spaces struggled when the environment refused to cooperate. This knowledge did not live in theory. It lived in the body, in the memory of marching rhythms, in the weight of armor, in the sound of commands echoing through controlled spaces. When he returned to his homeland, the contrast was immediate. The forest did not offer straight lines. The ground did not reward formation. The environment itself resisted imperial logic. Arminius carried this comparison inside him. Power, he realized, was not universal. It was conditional. Late-night history appreciates the quiet irony. The empire believed it was exporting order. What it actually exported was a detailed instruction manual on its own limitations. Arminius did not reject what he learned. He repurposed it. Knowledge became a tool rather than an identity. The body that had been trained to obey now understood when obedience was unnecessary. This is where empire meets its most dangerous student. Not the one who resists openly, the one who understands fully. He knew how long soldiers could march before exhaustion softened reaction time. He knew how weather affected morale. He knew how overconfidence crept in when resistance appeared fragmented. None of this required hatred, only observation. Late-night history notices how calm this process was. There was no dramatic break, no sudden betrayal, just a gradual alignment between memory and environment. When conflict came, it did not feel revolutionary. It felt inevitable. The empire experienced shock, not because it was defeated, but because it was understood. Its systems were mirrored back at it under conditions they were never meant to handle. Arminius did not fight as an outsider. He fought as someone intimately familiar with imperial expectations. He knew how commanders thought, how they interpreted information, how they dismissed warnings that did not fit established patterns. The body that had once marched in straight lines now moved through uneven ground with ease. This was not rebellion as chaos. It was structure meeting its opposite. Late-night history reflects on how often power assumes bodies can be rewritten. That education erases origin. That discipline replaces memory. Arminius demonstrates that bodies can hold multiple systems at once. His knowledge did not free his people in a permanent sense. Politics remained messy, alliances fractured. But for a moment, empire was forced to confront its own assumptions. The human body becomes central here, not as a symbol, but as a vessel of experience. Arminius did not need ideology to act. His body carried enough information. There is something almost understated about this. Empires fall in stories through grand gestures. In reality, they often stumble because someone learned too well. Late-night history allows a faint smile at this. Administrators praised assimilation while unknowingly cultivating resistance. The more thorough the training, the sharper the eventual insight. Power relies on repetition. The body learns repetition quickly, but once learned, repetition becomes predictable. Arminius used predictability as leverage. He did not overpower the empire. He redirected it. This does not make him a hero in the clean sense. Late-night history avoids that. It makes him a demonstration. The empire shaped his body. His body returned the lesson. What remains unsettling is how easily this pattern repeats. Systems train individuals believing control increases with knowledge. They forget that knowledge also increases autonomy. The human body is not a blank surface. It accumulates, it compares, it remembers. Late-night history sits with this quietly. Power is never just about authority. It is about how bodies respond to it, how they internalize it, how they eventually reinterpret it. Arminius understood the empire from the inside because he lived inside it. He did not need to imagine its weaknesses. He had marched with them. In the end, his most effective weapon was not the sword. It was familiarity. As the night deepens, this story settles into a broader pattern. Empires rise believing they are universal. They fall when someone proves they are situational. The human body carries that proof quietly, through movement, through memory, through adaptation. Late-night history leaves this here, not as a warning, not as a celebration, just as a reminder. Power always passes through flesh, and flesh learns faster than power expects. Power, empire, and the human body does not end when authority is established. It continues when authority decides to make itself permanent. After conquest settles and borders appear stable, the state begins to dream of endurance. Not memory, not loyalty, endurance. Late-night history follows the moment when ambition turns practical and the human body becomes the chosen material. Before the weight of this story deepens, let the pace slow. This is not the sound of marching armies. It is quieter. The scrape of baskets against stone. The dull rhythm of earth being packed by exhausted hands. The low breath of people who are no longer sure how long they are expected to last. Empires often imagine permanence as something architectural, walls, roads, towers that outlive names. What they rarely acknowledge is that permanence must first pass through bodies. The Qin state understood this with unsettling clarity. When unification was complete, the emperor did not relax. He accelerated. A united land was not enough. It needed to be fixed in place. The northern frontier remained unstable. Open land allowed movement. Movement allowed resistance. The solution was simple in concept and immense in cost. The state would build a barrier that reshaped geography itself, not a symbolic line, a physical one. And to build something that large, the state reached for the most available resource: people. Late-night history notices how quickly this shift happened. Victory was barely absorbed before labor quotas were issued. Lists appeared, names were called. Age mattered less than availability. Farmers were taken from fields, artisans from workshops, soldiers from garrisons. Punishment and service blended until they became indistinguishable. This was not framed as cruelty, it was framed as necessity. The language was administrative, neutral. The body was counted like timber or stone. One more unit required, one more unit supplied. The journey north erased individuality quickly. Lines of people moved together. Tools replaced possessions. Baskets replaced identity. Once at the frontier, time lost structure. Days were measured by exhaustion, rather than sunrise. Work began early and ended when bodies failed. Late night history lingers here because this is where the state becomes intimate, not through law or ceremony, but through proximity to breath and muscle. The state learned exactly how much pressure a body could withstand before breaking. When someone collapsed, they were replaced. The wall did not pause. Pain became routine. Hunger became expected. Relief was rare and functional, enough to stand again, enough to lift again, not enough to recover. Recovery was not part of the design. There is a quiet irony in how future generations would admire the wall as a triumph of engineering. Those who built it did not see engineering. They saw repetition: lift, carry, pack, repeat. The structure rose slowly, while bodies disappeared just as steadily. Late-night history allows a faint humor here. Dry and uncomfortable, the state praised efficiency while requiring constant replacement. Productivity was measured by progress of earth and stone, not survival. A wall that consumed workers was still considered successful. Burial was practical. When someone died, the nearest earth received them, sometimes intentionally, sometimes simply because stopping would disrupt the schedule. Over time, the wall absorbed not just labor, but memory. People became part of the structure they were forced to raise. The body under such conditions changes. Sensation narrows. Thought becomes repetitive. Survival reduces to the next movement. The state relied on this adaptation. Exhaustion limited resistance. Numbness reduced hesitation. Late-night history finds this deeply unsettling, not because it is unique, but because it is systematic. The Qin state did not invent forced labor. It refined it. It connected punishment, productivity, and permanence into a single mechanism. Officials recorded progress carefully. Length completed. Towers raised. Supplies consumed. They rarely recorded deaths. The absence was not oversight, it was design. Bodies were not meant to interrupt the narrative of success. Families left behind learned to fear conscription more than taxation. The wall became a warning. Obedience kept you home. Disobedience sent you north. Silence became survival. At night, camps quieted. Fires burned low. Bodies lay close, not for comfort, but for warmth. Stories were whispered, homes remembered. The wall loomed nearby, growing while sleep remained shallow and temporary. Late-night history notices how the wall changed meaning depending on where you stood. From the capital, it was protection. From the frontier, it was confinement. From the labor camp, it was horizon and grave at once. The state believed it was securing the future. What it secured was fear. Fear traveled faster than messengers. It reached villages before officials did. The wall did not need explanation. Everyone understood its cost. Even soldiers stationed along the frontier felt the weight. They guarded a structure still under construction. Raids continued. Weather punished everyone equally. Discipline held, but morale thinned. The wall demanded constant attention. It was never finished, only extended. Late-night history pauses to observe something subtle. The state did not collapse because of the wall. It weakened because of it. The same system that demanded endless labor also exhausted loyalty. The people learned what permanence required and resented it. When rebellion eventually spread, many who had survived the frontier joined it. They carried scars, knowledge, and nothing left to lose. The wall that was meant to secure power had taught people exactly how disposable they were. After the Qin fell, later dynasties reused the wall. They repaired it, extended it, admired it. But the memory of its origin lingered. Songs spoke of men who never returned, of bones beneath stone, of labor that outlasted life. Late-night history does not rush to moralize this. It simply observes the pattern. States that build themselves from flesh must eventually confront what remains when flesh is gone. The wall survived. The empire did not. What remains unsettling is how easily ambition turns bodies into material, how language smooths the process, how permanence is purchased with exhaustion rather than consent. Power, empire, and the human body leads naturally here. When authority decides to endure, it often forgets that bodies do not. They break. They fade. They remember. Late-night history rests on this thought quietly. The greatest structures in history are not only monuments to vision, they are records of how much the human body was asked to give. As the room grows still, let that settle without urgency. The wall stands. The night holds the rest. History does not usually end with noise. It ends with fatigue, with people lowering their hands because they are tired of holding them up, with systems continuing not because they are loved, but because enough bodies are still willing or forced to endure. Late-night history prefers this ending. It is quieter, more honest, less flattering. Before this last thought settles, let the room stay dim. This is not a conclusion meant to wake you. It is meant to explain why so much of history feels strangely numb when you look closely. We often imagine history as a sequence of decisive moments, declarations, victories, collapses that feel dramatic and intentional. But beneath those moments lies something far more persistent: exhaustion. Large symbols were rarely built in moments of clarity. They were built slowly by people too tired to argue with the process anymore. Monuments rise not because everyone believes in them, but because enough people continue to lift stones one more day. Empires survive not because they inspire constant loyalty, but because resistance requires more energy than compliance. Power learns this early. Endurance is easier to extract than enthusiasm. Late-night history notices that authority rarely demands passion. It prefers routine. It thrives on predictability. A tired population is a stable one, not content, not joyful, just functional. There is something darkly humorous in how this works. Grand symbols are celebrated for centuries while the conditions that made them possible are quietly forgotten. The fatigue that shaped them fades from record. The structure remains clean, solid, impressive. The cost becomes abstract. History is not loud because it does not need to be. It advances through repetition, through days that blur together, through people who stop asking when something will end and start asking how to get through today. This is why so much of history feels muted when examined closely. It was lived that way, not in a constant state of alarm, but in prolonged strain. Sensation dulled, expectations lowered, survival normalized. Late-night history sits with this discomfort. The past was not a series of awakenings. It was a long negotiation with fatigue. People adapted. Systems depended on that adaptation. Power did not always enforce itself through fear alone. It relied on weariness, on the simple truth that fighting back costs more than continuing. Endurance became the currency of stability. Even revolutions carry this pattern. They do not begin at full strength. They grow when exhaustion shifts direction, when continuing becomes more painful than change. Until then, history stays quiet. There is irony here. We admire resilience without asking what demanded it. We praise endurance without questioning why it was necessary. Late-night history does not accuse, it observes. The world we inherited was shaped by people who were often not fully present, not because they lacked intelligence or courage, but because constant pressure narrows awareness. The mind conserves energy. The body prioritizes continuation. This does not make history meaningless. It makes it human, messy, slow, unsettling. Silence plays a role here, not the silence of peace, but the silence of acceptance. When complaints stop because nothing changes, when routines replace hope, when the extraordinary becomes normal through repetition. Late-night history finds this both sobering and strangely calming. There is relief in understanding that history did not demand constant intensity. It allowed people to drift, to cope, to survive in incomplete states of attention. The past was not lived in sharp focus. It was lived in layers of fatigue and habit. That is why it feels distant, why its cruelty often appears understated, why its endurance feels haunting. Power persists not through brilliance alone, but through patience, through systems that wait people out, through structures that outlast individual will. History does not rush, it does not shout, it does not insist on being understood immediately. It lingers quietly, persistently, and perhaps that is why it feels so familiar. We recognize this rhythm: long days, repeated tasks, limited energy. The night that arrives not as relief, but as continuation. Late night history leaves you here not with a lesson, but with a recognition. The past was not fully awake. Neither are we, most of the time. We move forward anyway, tired, adapted, enduring. And history continues, not loudly, but steadily. Good night.